Hello, I'm Robert Viel, and today I'm talking about one of the oldest logos in Western history, the Lion of Venice. This glorious symbol for more than 1,000 years has represented the city of Venice, the Venetian Republic, and indeed the Venetian Empire, which spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Walking around the city of Venice today, one still encounters hundreds and hundreds of lions, symbols of this proud city. It's a very old symbol, but indeed the use of the lion as a symbol for religious and political purposes goes back a long, long time. We're looking now at one of the most famous of the lions of Venice, the Ebron Statue, which sits atop a granite column in St Mark's Square, overlooking the Doge's palace and St Mark's Basilica. It's a very, very old sculpture, probably dating back to about 300 BC from the Hellenistic Greek period. It was brought back to Venice in the Middle Ages and assembled together with the tail and the wings. In ancient times, it appears that lions, as a symbol of religious or spiritual significance, are linked to astrology, the observation of the heavens. So from the very earliest days in the Assyrian and Babylonian civilizations, people looked up to the stars, they saw formations of stars, and in their imagination they saw in those formations the forms of people, of animals and other beings. These were the constellations. As the stars moved, people ascribed meaning to that and thought that by looking at the stars they could predict the future, what the next battle would be like, whether it was a good time to harvest, whether there would be plague, whether there would be peace, etc. And the lion, or the constellation of Leo, as we know it, gained a kind of spiritual or religious significance. Eventually, of course, that significance was to find its way into the Judeo-Christian tradition. The first instance of the lion in the Judeo-Christian tradition comes in the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament. Now, Ezekiel was a prophet, and in his vision of the Lord, he sees a four-figured or a four-sided animal. This is the so-called tetramorph of the New Testament, and there on the right is an image of a tetramorph from the Greek Orthodox monastery of Meteora in northern Greece. But the description that Ezekiel, or that is given in the book of Ezekiel, is very clear. It describes a figure as having four heads or four sides to the head, one with the face of a man, another with the face of a lion, one with the figure of a calf or an ox, and the other with the face of an eagle. Around each of the faces are wings, and those wings touch, they intersect on the quarter according to Ezekiel. So it's a very clear description, and one that's used repeatedly in religious art. One has to get to the New Testament, however, to see the connection with St Mark. So by the time we get to the first centuries of Christianity, the four animals of the tetramorph have begun to become associated with the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This goes back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. So Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century AD, associates each of those evangelists with one of the animals of the tetramorph, though you'll see as you look through the table that that does not remain stable over the early centuries of Christianity. So by the time we get to the 6th century AD, the period of Gregory the Great, which is more or less about the time that Venice itself was founded, those animals have changed and have resembled or are associated with the four evangelists in a way that persists through the Middle Ages. So St Matthew, represented typically by a human figure, St Mark, as we know, by the lion, Luke, represented by the ox or the calf, and St John by the eagle. And of course, it's not just in writing that one sees these associations. So on the right is a mosaic, and a good example of early Christian art, and this is taken from the Basilica of St Apollinare in Classe, which is in Ravenna, just a few hours to the south of Venice, and it shows St Mark in the form of the lion descending onto the scene holding the book, the Evangel, in his hand. Of course, accompanying that mosaic are mosaics of the other evangelists. They're displayed on the chancel arch there on either side. So by this period, by the time of the foundation of Venice, the symbols are clear and the associations have become stable over time. Looking a couple of centuries later, for example, these are two examples, one from the Book of Kells, famous manuscript of the early 9th century, and on the right, a Lombard marble panel, a Pluteo, from a place called Cividale, just to the north of Venice. Both of those show the persistence of this symbolism, the association of the animals with the evangelists. But what about Venice and what about St Mark? To fill in this part of the story, of course, one needs to look at the famous or infamous removal of the body of the evangelist St Mark, this important relic, from Alexandria in Egypt to Venice. And this took place, according to the Venetian tradition, in 828 AD, and it was two Venetian merchants who we see on the left who managed to discover the body of St Mark, this most important relic, to hide it from Muslim officials, to put it on a ship and to take it back to Venice. This mosaic, which is a 19th century mosaic, is to be found on the facade of St Mark's Basilica in Venice, and it shows almost in a comical way what was going on in Alexandria in 828 AD. So on the left you see the two Venetian merchants, and they've got a basket, and inside that basket they'd placed the body of St Mark. In order not to get the attention or to escape the attention of the port officials of Alexandria, who were Muslim, of course, by that stage, they covered the body of St Mark in salted pork. And this particular scene shows the horror and the dismay of the turbaned Muslim port officials, turning their eyes away from the pork, holding their noses and letting the merchants depart as quickly as possible with these prohibited goods. So by this typical piece of Venetian chicanery, the relic of St Mark finds its way to Venice, and symbols of the lion begin to proliferate. This is the time, of course, that the Doge's palace is built, and right next to it, the Basilica of St Mark, which, apart from anything else, the Venetians saw as a fittingly grand residing place for these most important relics that were coming to define the city and its very special in history. Now, at about the time of the translation of the body of St Mark to Venice, an important thing is added to the symbolism, and that is the book with the lion. So here is an image of the winged lion, but this time it's holding a book, and that's open, and that has the first part of an important Latin inscription on it, Pax tibi Marce Evangelista meus, and it follows, Hic resquiat corpus tuum. Peace be with you, Mark, my evangelist. Here your body shall lie. That here, of course, refers not to Alexandria, but to Egypt, and it relates to a legend, told repeatedly by the Venetians, of course, that St Mark, when he was preaching, had to sail from Alexandria, just to the north of Venice, back to Rome. And as he was sailing through the Venetian lagoon, he was caught in a very bad storm. And in that storm, the angel appeared to him in a cloud and said those words, Peace be with you, Mark, my evangelist. Here your body shall lie. And indeed, after 828 AD, here in Venice, the body did lie. Symbols of St Mark are many and varied. And so we're looking at three different examples here on the screen to show you some of the subtleties. As you walk around the city of Venice, perhaps you'll become something of a lion expert and you'll be able to tell the difference of them. So the one on the left is an interesting example, and it seems to relate back to the ancient tetramorph. This is the version of St Mark which the Venetians call in mollecca, which is a dialect word for crab-like form, and that's referring to the fact that the wings tuck up there. It's a roundel and the wings tuck up above, rather like crab's claws. Now, because crabs are to be found in lagoons, according to Venetian tradition, this representation of St Mark is especially associated to the lagoon city of Venice. Looking at the right now, one has an altogether different kind of image of St Mark. In this one, the lion is holding a sword, and notice as well that the book that holds those words about St Mark is closed and the lion has its foot on the book. This image that you can see is part of a naval standard, a flag that would have been flown at the back of one of Venice's famous galleys. Now those two symbols, the closed book and the sword, are representative of Venice in a state of warfare. So this is St Mark, the Lion of St Mark, taking up the sword to conquer territories, to further the glory of the Venetian people. In the middle, we've got something of a mixed message. We have the lion, which on the one hand has the book open, indicating peace, but is also holding a sword. Now down below that image at the centre, quite interestingly, is a representation of the island of Crete, which was one of the Greek archipelago that Venice conquered and Venice ruled for centuries, establishing peace, but also a very important trading base. And it appears that the message here in this particular representation is twofold. We have Venice as the agent of peace, but also Venice the militarily strong. So perhaps it's telling us that Crete is in a state of peace and prosperity, the book open, thanks to Venice, but only achieves that state, of course, because of Venice's military prowess, represented by the sword in the lion's paw. So these symbols are many and varied. Perhaps the most famous political representation, though, of the Lion of St Mark is the one to be found above the beautiful Porta della Carta. This is the official entrance gate to the Doge's palace that you can see on the right of the slide. Now, this is the entrance that foreign dignitaries visited from or to, and this is also where all of the grand processions which characterized Venetian life departed from. So the party would leave the Doge's palace and process into the square and sometimes into the Basilica of St Mark. So right above that doorway then we've got a representation of one of the most important 15th century Doges, Francesco Foscari, and he's kneeling before the Lion of St Mark. Now the symbolic meaning of this, of course, is perfectly obvious. The Doge, the highest member of society, an almost semi-divine ruler of the Venetian state. But even the Doge pays homage to St Mark. Even the Doge is below the state. This republic which ruled the waves is more important than any other individual. Contrast that with the portraits and individuals who were the star of Roman and Florentine history in the Renaissance, and one begins to see the corporate nature of Venice and the very different characteristic. Now, a lot of that special nature was carried, of course, through the symbolism of the lion. The Renaissance brings other things as well, and one of those is a movement away from the medieval Christian tradition and a new appreciation for the ancient, for the antique, for the art, for the writing and for the philosophy which preceded Christian Europe. And so collecting pieces of the ancient world, sculpture and fragments, was a passion of the aristocracy of the Renaissance. If you've seen the collections of the Pope or the Medici in Florence, you'll have an understanding of that. In Venice, there's an altogether different and Venetian celebration of the ancient past. Key to understanding this is to remember, of course, that Venice itself did not exist at the time of the ancient Roman Empire. It was a sandbank. So when the Renaissance comes, Venice has to acquire antiquity of its own. So this monumental gateway that we're looking at is the entrance to the Arsenale, the important Venetian naval yard, and the triumphal arch with the temple front, which one can still walk through to this day to enter the Arsenale, is a prime and early example of the Renaissance style in Venice. It dates from about 1460. But I'm more interested in the four lions of different sizes and shapes that are sitting to the left and to the right of the Renaissance gateway. These are all spolia, pieces of classical antiquity which have been removed from their original locations and brought to Venice. Where were they removed from? Well, the Greek world, which had been, of course, part of the ancient Greek Empire and then part of the ancient Roman Empire. So to the right there, you've got one of the famous lions from the Lion Terrace of the island of Delos, whereas the large lion to the left of the gate we know comes from somewhere in Constantinople. We know that because it has on it, still to this day, barely visible inscriptions which are in the ancient Scandinavian runic language. Why? Because the Byzantine emperor had his own personal bodyguard of Vikings, or Varangians, he called them, and their language was runic. One can imagine perhaps one quiet summer afternoon in Constantinople, not much to do, the Varangian guard is a little bored, so a couple of their number decide to carve a message in runic on the side of the lion. Still keeping with the Renaissance, one of the most celebrated images of the Lion of Venice is this one by Vittorio Carpaccio from 1516, today displayed in the Doge's palace. And it's a terrifically interesting image if one looks at it quite closely. On the right, in the background, of course, one sees a representation of the Venetian maritime empire, those ships sailing out of a harbour. On the left, however, we have the Venetian land empire. This was something which Venice acquired in mainland Italy at the beginning of the 15th century with some struggle. By the time we get to the time that this painting was undertaken in 1516, Venice's glory days as a maritime empire were behind it. The New World had been discovered and trade was slowly shifting from the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Venice increasingly relied on its land empire, the terraferma, as a source of wealth. In between the terraferma, represented by the rocks and the trees on the left of the image, and the maritime empire, represented by the ships in the background, of course, is the city of Venice itself. But have a look at the lion. It's got two legs in the water and two legs on land, as if balancing between the maritime empire and the terraferma. I don't know if you've ever owned a cat as a pet, but one thing I can tell you is that they don't like water very much. So this is a rather unusual image of a lion, I think. Into the modern age, of course, the association with the Lion of St Mark and Venice persists. Sometimes it's in a political context. So the cartoon on the top left of this slide is from 1866. And this was during the unification of Italy, and northern Italy and the area of Venetia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Still, even though it was a good 6 years after Garibaldi and Cavour had united most of the rest of the country. So this political cartoon is showing Venice still in chains, linked to an injured Austro-Hungarian, while an Italian politician looks on imploringly from the right-hand side. In the 20th century, of course, the lion is associated particularly with Venice's cultural industry. And so on the top right, we see the celebrated Golden Lion. This is the grand prize for the Venetian Biennale of Art, that famous contemporary art fair that takes place every 2 years. I couldn't resist showing you the glorious red crocodile leather box in which this fantastic prize comes. Bottom left, same in film. This is the Taiwanese film director Ang Lee receiving the Golden Lion Award at the Venice Film Festival. Bottom right is the logo of the Generali Insurance Company, one of Italy's largest insurers, whose origins lie in maritime insurance for the Venetian Republic in its dying days in the 18th century. And last but not least, 1980s, pop icon Madonna chooses to record the video of her first big hit, Like a Virgin, in the city of Venice. Venice, of course, often associated itself with the Virgin Mary, perhaps here represented by Madonna, I'm not sure about that, but wandering around with Madonna in Venice during this film clip is a lion. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.